for the grad class I was in, for 26 roles, they got 35,000 applications.
Wow.
Simply because everyone wants to work at an investment bank.
Yeah. Thanks for coming in, and nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
We've had plenty of LinkedIn communication in the past, but never actually physically met. So this is good. So if you wouldn't mind giving like a really rough intro, who you are, what you do, what the kind of rough backstory is, and then we can go from there.
Sure. I'm Alex. I'm a KDB developer. I have roughly 10 years of experience. I started out in Citigroup in a graduate tech scheme, got into KDB, quite enjoyed it, and then sticked with it. So I have worked across different investment banks, Citigroup, UBS, HSBC, Morgan Stanley, and right now I'm a consultant at Data Intellect. Data Intellect is one of the biggest big data KDB technology consultancy firms, and they specialize in everything big data for financial industry.
Cool. We always start, and we have an opening tradition on this podcast, with a basic game of word association.
Okay.
I say the word recruiter. What's the first thing that comes to mind?
Funny. My wife, she's a recruiter, but also, kind of like, I'm not the biggest fan of recruiters, to be honest. It's hard to find good ones or ones that really care about you as a client, which is unfortunate because I think we both need each other. Like if you're looking for a job, you need recruiter. In big cities like London or New York, everything goes via recruiters. And on the other hand, if you're a recruiter, you want to place a candidate. So obviously you need good candidates. So we should rather try to live in an ecosystem rather to be our enemies or not treat each other well. Because once you find a good recruiter, it's most likely you're going back to that guy all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, see, I mean, it's interesting you use the word enemies because that's obviously quite a strong characterization. Second question, off the back of that, knee-jerk again, what's the worst experience you've had with a recruiter? Don't say the names, but just...
No. Yeah. I had quite some bad experiences where recruiters would just ghost you. So like they reach out to you, and at the beginning it feels kind of like a honeymoon phase or kind of like being in love. They will promise you, or like kind of like when you first start dating, like people show their best side and then they try to do whatever to kind of like convince you to apply for a role. And then maybe you do interviews and you do a couple of rounds, and then the outcome is not positive for whatever reason. It's not always your performance isn't good enough, but you have to understand there are hundreds or sometimes thousands of people applying for the same role. So sometimes it just comes down to certain preferences of the hiring manager or some small details that are beyond your own skill set. And then the recruiter just doesn't come back or doesn't give you feedback. And I perfectly understand that recruiters get millions of messages. Like, as I said, my wife is a recruiter. I've seen her LinkedIn account. I see the number of messages she gets. But when we're at a stage that I've did 3-4 interviews with you as a recruiter, you should at least give me feedback on what went wrong and how I can improve for the next time. And another really bad thing that I see happening very often is like, I get a cold message on LinkedIn, and the guy starts opening, "Hey, Alexander, I've seen your profile. You're a perfect candidate for the role I have." And then he goes on pitching me a job description for a senior Java developer with 10 years of experience. Now, I'm a KDB developer. I have nowhere on my LinkedIn profile or CV that I have Java experience. And if you go through my roles, you can see that the last 10 years I've done only KDB at investment banks or consultancy. So why are you pitching me a Java role?
Yeah. I think so on the first point, 100%, like recruiters have a lot to deal with, but if someone's made the effort to go to interviews on the behalf of the recruiter to an extent, like the recruiter is the vehicle that's managing that, even if you don't have feedback, if it's just, look, we don't want to proceed, but as a recruiter, sometimes we don't get the reason why. They can still let you know that and say, look, I'm trying to get it. I can only pass on the information that I have, but I need to let you know this is the feedback, and the whole ghosting thing is not a good thing. I saw a thread on LinkedIn the other day that was on this subject, and I can't remember who said it, but there was a guy who was sort of talking about no feedback, and he was saying, it's on the recruiters to deliver detailed feedback for the candidate so they know how they can improve, especially if they're out of work and they're trying to find a job or whatever, which in an ideal world I agree with. To give maybe a little bit of a recruiter's side of the coin, if someone is not offered a role for a reason like they weren't technically quite where they need to be, or there was another candidate who just had a little bit more in this area, but this area was good, whatever, we'll get the feedback. But I would say that's 3 or 4 times out of 10. The rest of it is more, particularly perm, is much more subjective of like, just didn't quite like them. Not didn't like them as a person, just didn't feel they were the right fit relative to someone else, but can't put my finger on it.
Yeah.
And companies will never give that feedback because it immediately opens them up for the individual to push back. And they don't want to be pushed back because they've made the decision and then they've moved on, and they've more than likely moved on to someone they are trying to progress with. So I don't think we're ever going to get to the perfect scenario, which is everyone gets feedback that you can take away and be constructive. But I 100% agree. The onus is on recruiters, where if someone is investing time in an interview process, the recruiter owes them at least whatever feedback they've got, and honesty around that.
And you can even sugarcoat it. You don't have to tell me the exact truth. If someone says like, look, Alex was really good technically, but like from a personality, we don't see him as a fit.
Yeah.
If you don't give me that feedback. At least come back to me and say, hey, I tried to get feedback. They didn't really had something, or the manager didn't came back with me. So I'm afraid, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's not happening this time. But like, there were so many of times where I did a final round interview and then the recruiter just goes silent. I don't hear anything for weeks.
Yeah.
And the way I approach interviewing is as long as I don't hear a final no, I still assume I'm in the process.
Still live, yeah.
And then it just gets, this uncertainty. Am I gonna get the role? Is it like slow on the hiring manager? Do they have to go
and then
through
other
bureaucracy?
People pitching you new opportunities, but you don't know where you're at with.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a stain on the industry, and I think a lot of the frustration people have with recruiters in general. The second point that you made about getting irrelevant messages and stuff, all Java when you're a KDB guy, whatever, is very like true as well. But I think people get less upset. People would be less upset about that sort of stuff if the basic, decent, just giving someone feedback after they've been to an interview and closing it off, if recruiters handled that stuff properly, it would probably make all the rest of it a bit more tolerable. And then on the second bit, I mean, that's fundamentally like, they're just not very good at their job.
Yep.
Those ones probably can go in the blocked pile pretty quickly. The thing I'm quite interested in understand, so KDB, I know high level KDB, time series data, etc. I know that it's very popular in the trading world, particularly in the equity space, but I don't really know a lot more. How did you kind of get into that? So you mentioned grad rotation. So was it just sort of put on you, or did you try and go down that route?
So I actively wanted to go down that route. So I have a little bit of mixed background between a tech guy and a finance guy. I'm from North Italy, where you can already specialize at the high school level. So I did the high school as a programmer, didn't find it that interesting at the time. I graduated in 2006. That was pre-iPhone area. Facebook was just about to hit off. And I didn't really want to study computer science. So I just started to apply for jobs after high school, and by coincidence, I got into a small investment bank. I was the assistant of a portfolio manager for 3 years, from 2006 to 2009, throughout the financial crisis. And when I was first sitting in front of a Bloomberg terminal, I immediately fell in love with finance. Like, for me, it was very impressive that with smart decisions, making good investment decisions, you can actually make good money. So at the time, I wanted to become a portfolio manager. And then I started my bachelor in economics and management. And throughout my second year, I came across an article in The Economist about computers taking over Wall Street. And that's when I realized I like programming and I like finance. And that's how I can combine these two passions. So I decided to get a degree in computational finance here in the UK. And then when I moved to London, I moved in with a friend from back home who was just starting at Citigroup in the grad scheme, and he was working with KDB. So he told me about KDB, and I was like, it's strange. I've never heard about this programming language. What is it about? So I started to read about it, and I realized it's used very close in the financial industry, on the business side of things. The quants use it. So I thought it's perfect for me because I can specialize in something that's always going to be used in the financial industry, and that's where my passion is. So I then decided at Citigroup that I want to join the KDB team, which I did, and then I pretty much learned it on my own. I got thrown into the cold water at Citigroup in the grad scheme. Here are some tasks, start doing them, start reading the book Q for Mortals. I did that, and it was particularly hard at the beginning because it's a very steep learning curve. It's very different from any other programming language. It's a vector or array-oriented programming language with kind of like an inbuilt database, and it's very good for time series analysis. It's very fast, faster than pretty much anything else out there. So that's why it's used in the financial industry. And then 1.5 years ago, I decided to start my own blog, DefconQ.tech. It's a blog where I try to teach people KDB who are not coming through a consultancy firm. So Data Intellect, the company I work for, they were formerly called AquaQ, and First Derivatives, the consultancy firm that was owned by KX but has been sold off now. Those two companies, they specialized in hiring people, training them, and providing consultants to investment banks or hedge funds. So like the typical career path would be you join one of those consultancy firms as a graduate, you go through their training program, through their grad scheme, and then they put you into an investment bank to work as a KDB consultant. So that is normally easier because they provide you with like a very big amount of training. So it's very different than learning KDB on your own than going through this consultancy. For example, the grad scheme we do at Data Intellect, like this 3-month training is equivalent to a 1-year kind of like self-study or initial work experience at the client. So we prepare people very, very good so that as soon as they hit the ground with one of our clients, they can be productive and work on the project they're being given. So for people who want to learn KDB, but they're not coming through a consultancy firm, I decided I start a blog and I teach some of the stuff there online for free. It's accessible to everyone. I launched a newsletter as well, so you can subscribe for free. You get updates to your inbox all the time. That's KDB in a nutshell.
So when you were making the decisions around doing your bachelor's and computational finance, that sort of thing, how old were you then?
So I went back to uni when I was 23. I finished my bachelor with 26 and then moved. I had to do one gap year because the bachelor finished in September, so I couldn't start straight away. So I did my master's. I did 2 masters, one at the University of Essex and one at UCL, University College of London. And then I got into the grad scheme at City when I was 28. So I was pretty much the oldest person in the grad scheme.
But that's still quite a high level of maturity at that age to identify those things and then go and do the computational finance. And then when you rolled into City, were you sitting in tech or in the business?
I was sitting on the tech side.
Right.
It was a tech grad scheme, but we worked closely with the business side.
Yeah.
So the business wouldn't, I want to say it wouldn't survive without tech.
Yeah.
I know tech is often seen in investment banks as a cost center. The majority of investment banks actually consider tech as a cost center. Which sure, like it comes at a cost, but the business wouldn't do anything without us.
Yeah. That's a big difference I see with banks and hedge funds.
Yeah.
Where I think banks see it as a cost and innovation is always a little bit behind the curve.
Yeah.
Because if you've got a system that isn't necessarily cutting edge, but it does the job, why are you going to spend money, on more? Why are you going to spend more money on bonuses to retain people, etc., when they're in tech? Whereas I think funds very much see it as a source of revenue generation and probably are further along in understanding, like, especially nowadays, like you've got nothing if you haven't got tech. Especially the more you get into the fields of like latency and horsepower and everything else. With the City, the grad program, like what are the mechanics of that? Because those sort of like banking entry grad rotations where you get different looks are really highly regarded, particularly in the hedge fund world. So we get a lot of steer from hiring managers, especially when they're trying to hire like junior to mid-level people, of get me someone who's just coming out of a grad program at one of the good banks, and then we'll try and take them. But mechanically, like, why are they so valuable? How do they work?
I would say it even starts before the grad schemes. So as I mentioned, I did 2 masters, one in Essex and one at UCL. Now, the reason why I did the second one at UCL was because I could not land a job with the University of Essex on my CV. Yeah. I sent like 300 applications, nothing. I didn't even got a phone screening or anything. Yeah. And then I went to UCL, and I was 1 week there, and I just updated my CV and sent out the applications to all investment banks, and suddenly I had interviews with all the top tier investment banks. Yeah. Because the grad schemes, they work like, they open the application in September, and by December, if you haven't secured a grad scheme for the next year, September, you're not getting a job.
Yeah.
And it's even one step further, like 50% of the roles in the grad scheme are filled with the interns from the previous summer.
Right.
So it's very competitive to get into a grad scheme. So in order to get in, you need to have a degree from a top tier university, like the likes of UCL, Oxford, Cambridge, and LSE, and so on. And that's simply because the number of applications an investment bank gets, they're incredible. Now, in my second year at Citigroup, I volunteered to assist with the grad assessment center, and I got the chance to speak to one of the HR ladies, and I actually asked her how many applications we get. So for the grad class I was in, for 26 roles, they got 35,000 applications.
Wow.
Simply because everyone wants to work at an investment bank.
Yeah.
And in the first week of my grad scheme at Citigroup, we did these team building exercises, and all the peers, they came from the same 5 universities. And no investment bank will admit this, that they're filtering. But simply from a numbers game, it's not possible to go through 35,000 applications.
No, of course.
And also, like, everyone has a first or a 2.1.
Yeah.
So even your grade doesn't really matter or sets you apart. You need to do other stuff, extracurricular stuff. You need to have your GitHub repo. You need to have projects you're doing, all that stuff to set yourself apart. And then on top of that, like whoever is hiring you, they just go and say, okay, I want people from these 5 universities, because they assume if someone got into Oxford, Cambridge, UCL, that was already a pre-screening. So they already selected only the top candidates, which is often not the case. Like, I've seen people from Oxford and Cambridge, and I wouldn't say they're any other than a no-name university. But again, the investment bank doesn't have the time.
It's interesting because we see now sometimes developers in particular that are more senior, and maybe they started in the 90s.
Yeah.
They don't have degrees, or they don't have very good degrees relative to, like, they didn't go to Cambridge. They might have a BTEC or something like that. But they have 20 years, 25 years of real world commercial experience in really good shops.
Yeah.
But we'll get the feedback of, no, hasn't got a degree. And it's like, but 20 years of, you know, relative to, like, if you had someone with exactly the same experience and a degree, like, how much is that degree in the real world going to carry over all of that time when you put, even if it's computer science, like, I get the modular value of computer science, but in the real world, people don't follow the modules to the letter. They have a commercial approach to coding.
Yeah.
In the same way as when you drive a car, you don't follow the theory test to the absolute letter.
Yeah.
You respond to the real world. But there's still that natural filtering that you mentioned, when in reality, it probably isn't that good at all, really. But again, there's so many applications direct. And then for recruiters we don't have the luxury of being able to test people technically. So academics is a really easy filter for us to just rule people out. And again, it's like, goes back to the feedback thing. You're never going to get to the ideal world of, you know, everyone being evaluated solely on merit, because everyone has their biases and everyone is looking for these filters. And I guess it puts the onus a little bit on the individual, like you mentioned, of what does your Git look like? You know, what are your projects? What are the things that you're working on? This is stuff that's come out in previous podcasts that I've done with people, where if you're not doing more to stand out, if you're not, you know, making the effort to go to UCL, if you're settling in with Essex, how much different would your career look at this point? You know, where would you be relative to where you are now based on that, just going the extra mile a little bit?
Oh, I wouldn't have a job.
Yeah.
Like I know people who are not coming from top tier universities, they're struggling.
Yeah.
They're not landing a role. But when it comes to someone with 20 years experience, especially a lot like at big names, like I think that's more relevant than a degree. Especially
100%.
because 20 years ago, like times were different. Wall Street hired pretty much anyone and they were getting big money and big bonuses. Like we're no longer in those times, you know, it's not late 80s or, you know, the early 2000s. But still, if someone has a couple of years at a big name, a big shop, then I would take that over any other.
It seems to me from a recruiter's perspective that banks in particular can be a little bit more like vertically structured in a sense of you do less from a bandwidth perspective, but you maybe go more specialist into what you do. Whereas funds seem a little bit more, you have the thing that you do, but then you have to have this like multidiscipline skill set of supplemental skills. And then you have to be able to communicate with different users in the business, in ops, in, you know, in risk, whatever, and tech. And then you have that pressure of you're in a bit more of, you're a bit closer to the fire. And it seems to me that banks, that manifests more as there's more structure around requirements and maybe there's more layers to the business. You've got more BAs kicking around, this sort of thing. Funds, it seems a little bit more like they hire people that have those skills. They give them the ball and then sort of point them where they're trying to go. But then it's very much on the individual to get the ball to the end zone sort of thing.
There's also much more red tape in investment banks and more bureaucracy. So especially when it comes to getting new hardware, it can take forever, like 18 months easily in an investment bank, whereas like on the buy side, and this comes back to like, do we see tech as a cost center or not? We know we want to run something very fast. We need bigger machines. They make the investment. They don't, I mean, they consider the cost, but they are also not shy making a big investment if it's needed. So it's much faster in that kind of.
Could banks get there, or are they too big?
That's a good question. I think banks, they got really big and they are now under pressure, like having decreased profits. So they're trying to cut costs. So they're trying to get smaller, I would say.
Is there a way though in that, sorry to cut in, that you become more innovative with tech? You leverage AI, automation as a way of cutting your headcount, therefore cutting costs. But you increase spend on tech, cut headcount costs, prioritize those that have that broader skill set, and then try and supplant them with technology and, you know, AI and everything else. Is that something that's feasible?
I think it's definitely possible to increase efficiency of developers leveraging AI. The problem with the financial industry is like they're most of the time very secretive. So they don't want to upload, you know, client information or what they're doing to a public AI like ChatGPT or DeepSeek or whatsoever. They're afraid that this data gets out in the public and someone else might get access to it. It's already like super hard to upload data in the cloud because, you know, in the cloud, your data is shared with other customers on the same boxes. So certain data you cannot upload into the cloud because for compliance reasons or regulations, you're not allowed to have your data on a box with your competitors. So I think AI can make developers much more efficient, but it's going to be bureaucratically a little bit hard for banks to get it internally. Now, what I've seen is that a lot of banks will run their own LLM models inside and have their own version of ChatGPT internally. Yeah. Now, how good and how powerful that is and how helpful it is, that has to be evaluated on a case-to-case basis.
I guess you have to be willing to make the investment in getting the right people through the door to build your own proprietary stuff that's actually going to be able to add value in the real world. Because I know, I mean, funds, there's a lot of projects kicking off, exploratory in and around building proprietary models and what you can do with reinforced learning and deep learning and all this sort of stuff. But again, I guess the question is, because we're seeing in banks, historically, the route of progression has been very linear into leadership. So, which it makes sense to me from a perspective of they're really big organizations, so you need some structure. But in my experience, like 6, 7 out of 10 developers are really, really passionate about tech and they enjoy cutting code. And what seems to happen is banks take really good developers, but then they push them away from the code by giving them leadership responsibility. And then you get stuck in that trap of, if you want more money and you want more scope and more progression, you've got to give up the thing that you actually enjoy. We are seeing in recent years, though, these emergences of like the distinguished engineer or the staff engineer or the principal, of someone that maybe sits at a level where you would expect them to have a team. Maybe they're an ED or something like that, but they're still technical and they just tend to have a broader scope, which to me is more of a hedge fund sort of, that's a more traditional thing that you see there. So it does seem like banks are maybe starting to recognize that we need to create alternate routes in order to retain the best people, because the best technologists normally want to stay fairly technical.
Yeah, I think it's the worst thing you can do, pushing someone very techy away and put him into a leadership role or management role if the person is not a leader or a manager. I've seen and experienced it myself, and it's like someone needs to want to manage a team. If they do not want to manage a team and they want to be hands-on developer, techie, then it's the worst thing that you push them into a role they don't want to have, because it's not good for a team. Because like someone who doesn't want to be a manager will never be a manager. They will not care about their team. They will, not do the tasks a manager needs to do. And that's, I don't want to say slowing down your team, but it's creating frustration in the team, especially with the more junior people who are still in need of a manager, who are still looking for the feedbacks and the growth opportunity. And just because you don't want to pay a developer more, you push him down the management route. I think that's the wrong approach.
Yeah. Well, you put them in a rock and a hard place of like, everyone wants more money. And the world we live in now, like you need more money because everything's really expensive, and it's how you chart progression. So people, obviously lots of people work in banks. They want that progression. They want the recognition. They want the money. They don't want to be a manager. So you're in that position of, well, what do? You can go and work for a hedge fund where they'll keep you technical and pay you more. But for every 10 developer roles in a bank, there might be one in a hedge fund. And you need there to be a new project or someone to leave, which doesn't happen that often. So it's not an easy thing to just go and find something else. So then you get all these people that seem to be stuck. And I'd say the most common profile we recruit for is the kind of senior VP, ED type person in a bank who's very technical and they're on that cusp of being pushed away from it.
Yeah.
That's who hedge funds most seem to hire for, because they don't want to train the junior people really. They want to bring people in and give them the ball. I'd say 7, 8 times out of 10 of why those people would even pick the phone up to me in the first place is I'm getting pushed into management. I've got 2 or 3 people now. I'm a tech lead. I like that. My next step is like 7 or 8 people, and I don't want to do it, but I do want the recognition of forward progression. And surely it gets to a point where you start looking and going, why do we keep losing all these really good people?
Yeah, and I see that happening where a senior developer is like, okay, I don't want to be a manager, but I also would like to have a little bit more. And then they go like, no, we're not going to give you a raise. And then the guy's like, okay, I'm leaving. And then they have to pay 30-40% to backfill that role.
Yeah. Which,
like if you give someone a 10-15% increase, they might be happy. But if they are leaving, you have to hire someone externally. And honestly, like if I'm not getting paid 25% more, it's often not worth the time and effort to interview with someone else. Because the first year I need to prove myself anyway. So I need to work harder. So I wouldn't, like for a 10% pay increase, I wouldn't move.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense. If I'm in a comfortable role where I have been for a few years and I need to go somewhere else, and let's say I go mid-year, so I already know my bonus is going to be, you know, proportional to the time I did there. And let's say if you're not already super senior and you're not getting promoted anyway, if you're moving at like an associate level, or if you still have some promotions to come in your career, then moving comes with the risk of not getting promoted for the next 1 to 2 years. Because a promotion process in a bank takes also time. You're not getting promoted from 1 month to the other. Normally, you have to kind of like tell your manager that you want to be promoted next year. You start this conversation at the beginning of the year. By mid-year, most of the time, it's already kind of like decided who's going to be promoted in January, February or not. You need to be on the right projects, you need to get the visibility. Often you need sponsors, meaning that you need to have 2 people who kind of like vouch for you that are at the higher level you want to get at. So it's like a very tedious and long process. So if I'm in a position where I'm applying for another job and I'm only getting a 10% increase, it might not be worth my time. It also comes with a risk, like, how is the other team going to be like? Is it going to be worse than my current team or better? Like, am I going to learn something? How are the colleagues? What are the projects I'm going to work on? So unless the pay increase is significantly more than what I'm on right now, or I really hate the place where I'm at, then why would I move?
Yeah, especially to go from bank to bank.
Yeah.
Because you're just effectively trading the same problems for a different flag. So I spoke to a lady last week at, I won't say the name, a big American bank. She's probably VP, been rated as exceeding expectations, front office, equities, blah, blah, blah. Bonus 6%. And she's like, I'm going to leave because I just feel how can I be exceeding and be 6%? But then I know what will happen is she'll leave and they'll just throw money at her to stay because they won't want to lose her. But you sort of think, why don't you just give her a bit more and front load it? And then you save yourself all of those problems down the line of potentially losing people because you're just not progressive enough. Like you say, 10, 15%, probably going to keep you there.
I mean, that's also like kind of like unspoken rule, which I don't understand. A lot of banks, they're like, okay, you have to come with an offer that we can match to give you an increase. But like, I'm the person. So basically, if you match the offer I get, you were underpaying me like until the minute I show up with the offer.
Yeah.
So then that's literally just, you know, you're making a fool out of me because you're underpaying me or lowballing me. And I have to say, like, if I start interviewing, I'm with 1 foot out the door.
Yeah.
And I had the situation where I wanted to leave a place because they did not had a role that I wanted. And they literally told me, look, the role you want, we don't have it. So I was like starting to look outside, got an offer, resigned. And the moment I resigned, the manager literally went, tell me what you want so you're not leaving. Just because he had 2 people leave like the month before, and it would have come back badly on him if there's a big turnaround in his team. And I'm just like, look, I'm not doing it for the money or the title. It's just like, I really wanted this role and you couldn't give it to me. And now you're telling me you're going to do whatever it takes to open this role. So that's literally just making a fool out of myself. And like, why would I take that risk? Why would I take that word that you're going to actually open up that role, even though I've spoken with other managers that told me that this role will not exist. Yeah. So I'm not going to take the risk. I'm just going to go to a place who values me. And I was actually negotiating with an investment bank. And this was very early in my stage. And I had like kind of like a target salary I wanted, which I told HR, and they were like, okay, what if we pay you £2,000 less than that? And I was like, okay, I mean, fine.
Why?
No, it doesn't make a difference to me. 2,000, I'm playing the long game. For me, £2,000 doesn't make the difference, which a lot of candidates also don't understand. They negotiate for 5, even 10K which I find ridiculous, because in the long run, that doesn't make a difference.
Yeah.
But HR, basically, they just wanted to see whether I'm such a person that I'm like insisting on a 2K difference. And I said, look, if you want to pay me 2,000 less, fair enough. I'm happy with it. And then they paid me what I wanted in the end. So it was just kind of like to see whether I'm really stubborn or insisting on something that in the long run doesn't make a difference.
It's probably see whether you actually wanted to be there, or if it was just like whether you were genuinely interested in the role, or whether it was just a pure, money play. Because I think also companies are really wary of just getting bought into bidding wars, and I think when they see people that are all about the money, it puts them off a little bit, because they sort of think, okay, we can make you an offer, but you could then put it in your pocket and go and shop it around everywhere else. And there's not really a lot we can do about that at that point. We can't rescind the offer. Like, we can't not give you time to think about it. But as soon as they make the offer, everything else has to stop. They can't offer anyone else. Maybe they've got other people as backups. They've now moved on. So it does become quite a sort of a game of chess almost, which is not really a great way to do it, because you'd want, if you're joining a new company, you want that experience to be seamless and positive. You want to feel valued, like they really want you there. And they want to feel like you really want to be there. It's sort of a shame that you have to get into these games of like, well, we'll just pay you 2K less. And you can say, well, yeah, it doesn't make much difference to me after tax a year, what is it? But equally you could say, well, you're an investment bank. Like, what's two grand to you?
Yeah.
It does, for such a professional industry, when you get really down to like you were negotiating over 1,000, like a couple of grand, it's a bit ridiculous. One thing I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the, I guess, contract and perm, but just tech in general, labor market, developers, engineers, tech folk in general, how do you see the next couple of years progressing for the individuals looking to like just progress and have a good job and make progress in their career?
Yeah. I think it's definitely going to stay a challenging market. With AI taking away some of the jobs, I'm not saying that it will take away everything, but it's going to make developers definitely much more efficient. So you're going to need less developers, and you might need less junior people to do the tasks. But at the same time, companies want to train up someone junior into a senior role, because at some point you're going to lose your seniors and you have to replace them. So I definitely going to see the tech market staying a challenging place to be in. You're going to have to continuously train, keep up with the trends, or you specialize in something very niche where there are not that many people outside on the market. But that also comes with the downside that you're going to have much less roles. KDB is very niche. Last time I checked, there are roughly 8,000 people on LinkedIn worldwide who have KDB on their LinkedIn. You take away 2,000-3,000 people who work on a business side, who queried a KDB database once and just thought they were going to put KDB on their LinkedIn to make them more appealing. So you probably have around 4,000 or 5,000 developers out there. If you compare that to Python, in Canary Wharf alone, you find probably 4,000 Python developers or more.
Yeah.
So that puts you in the position where you're very specialized and you might find a job easier. You have less competition, but the number of jobs are obviously also much less.
Do you think it's played out where you've got that niche in-demand skill? Have you found it easier relative to maybe people with more general skill sets? Or given that there are less jobs, is it still much of a muchness?
I think it clearly had its advantages, but also drawdowns. Like during COVID, the number of roles out there where last year was particularly bad. Maybe there were 5-6 roles throughout the year that would have been interesting to me, which is very, very little.
And are they coming from agencies, or are they coming from people in the industry already?
You find a little bit of both. You will see recruiters that are reaching out from in-house directly with roles they're trying to fill. And then you would have agencies that try to find a contractor or a consultant. So it's a mix of both. But it's a hard market when you also reach a more senior stage, because the demand for senior developers is even less. You have a period where everyone is trying to find someone junior or mid-level, but once you hit a certain threshold in terms of experience, it's also going to be harder to get a role.
Do you think you would, moving forwards over the rest of your career, stay very centered in KDB, or do you think you'll have to branch out into something broader?
I mean, hopeful thinking is that I can stay in KDB just because, I have roughly 10 years of experience. I built my brand with my blog. I'm well established in the KDB scene. I'm also speaking at conferences. So I hope I can stick with KDB, but I also have to see what the market is doing. And if banks or hedge funds are moving away from KDB and there's not going to be, opportunities for me to keep doing what I'm doing right now, then I probably have to shift to something else. Ideally, I want to stay in the KDB world because I quite enjoy KDB. But if there are no roles, then there's not much I can do about it.
Yeah. And then just to bring it back to recruitment a little bit, what do you want moving forwards, contract or perm, whatever way you're looking? What do agencies need to be doing better for you as, we're all kind of navigating this kind of new world of AI and IR35 and everything else? How can agencies be adding more for you to make your life easier from that perspective?
A little bit more of a collaboration with, candidates. Like, just if you're representing a candidate, just try to treat them fairly. Like, okay, like, if something doesn't work out, just tell them for whatever reason, or even if you have to sugarcoat it, like, any answer is going to be better than no answer, and especially in times like now where a lot of people struggle to find a role. For someone who applied at so many jobs and not hearing back from anyone, it's really, really challenging for people, also for their mental health. And I do understand that you're getting a lot of candidates, a lot of messages, and I'm not saying reply to everyone who sends you an in message on LinkedIn. You can't do it. Like, it's just your hundreds or thousands of messages. But let's say you have a candidate and his profile looks good, and you put him forward and he does a couple of rounds of interviews, and for whatever reason they're not going forward, just tell him, look, I'm sorry, it's a no. For whatever reason, if you have the feedback, just give the feedback. If the feedback isn't something you're confident communicating, just tell them, like, okay, they really like your text set, but the other candidate was slightly better, so they went for him, or stuff like that. Just like, let's try to build like an ecosystem where we are all working towards the same goal, which at the end of the day we are. Like, I want a new role, you want to place someone. So we're kind of like, if you see us as a team trying to fill that role together, then, it's much more productive and much nicer. And like, I had, in all my years, I had one good experience with a recruiter, and that's the only guy. And I'm happy to mention him. It's Aaron O'Sullivan. He's working for Fourier at the moment. And like, we're friends now. We're having catch-up lunch every now and then. And
so what made that process the one that stands out as good? Just communication, touch points, feedback, or other things?
He actually went the extra mile to land me a role. So this was at the time when I was moving from Citi to Morgan Stanley. And the reason why I was moving was because Citigroup was closing the KDB team in London, and they would have moved me either to Belfast or to Singapore. And I wanted to stay in London. So I found this, like, Aaron found me this role at Morgan Stanley, and I applied, and I did like 4 rounds of interviews, and then they all went really, really well. And then he called me and he's like, look, they were really, really happy with your tech performance, but unfortunately they don't want to go ahead because they had some bad experience from people applying from Citi, just trying to get an offer, to get a counter offer from Citi. And that's the reason they don't want to go ahead with you. And then I was like, look, Aaron, Citi is closing the KDB team in London. I really need, or really want to stick with KDB. So I need another job. So if Morgan Stanley is making me an offer, I'm signing. I don't mind. I don't care anything. I will sign. I give you my word. And he went back to the hiring manager and explained the situation. And then I had another additional interview with HR, and then it worked out. So not only did he went the extra mile to actually tell me what was the reason, But he even went back to the hiring manager explaining the situation. And I had plenty of occasions where I would do an interview. I think it went really, really well. And then I wouldn't hear anything. No, okay, they didn't went for you, or that's the reason why they rejected you. So he told me what was the issue. And then when I told him, like, look, this is my situation. I really want to join Morgan Stanley because I want to stick in KDB, and Citigroup is closing the role in London. He went back to them, explained the situation to them, and then I had another interview with Morgan Stanley, and then it worked out. And I haven't seen anyone doing that.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like as good a note to wrap things up as any. So Aaron, I don't know you, but good for you, mate. Good job. And Alex, thank you so much for coming in. It was really nice to meet you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.